Combat in Dungeons and Dragons usually takes place on solid ground, but there's a whole world to explore and to fight in underwater as well. Sunken temples, lost civilizations, even just submerged shipwrecks or flooded dungeons. All of these can be really exciting ways to involve your characters in underwater combat. Hi, I'm Jeremy, I'm a writer, and this is my YouTube channel where I make videos about all things imaginary. This video is another episode in my series called Experience Gain, where I talk about Dungeons & Dragons and how you can get the most out of your role-playing games. With Ghosts of Saltmarsh coming out a little later this year, I wanted to talk about underwater combat. It's actually one of my favorite ways to do combat in D&D, and I think it's an aspect of combat, an aspect of the game that's really underutilized. I figured sitting out here also would be a better way to talk about it. Unfortunately, my house is currently suffering from a lot of water damage and renovation, so I can't talk about things in there. So let's get right down to it. How does underwater combat work? Well, the rules involved are actually pretty simple. Hey, kitty. I've got my notes here on my phone to go through it. The first rule set that we need to talk about is holding your breath. Underwater, that's going to be a pretty essential part of combat for any non-aquatic race. The rule in the book is that a creature can hold its breath for a number of minutes equal to 1 plus its constitution modifier for a minimum of 30 seconds. So even if you have a negative constitution modifier, you'll at least be able to hold your breath for 30 seconds. And you might be able to hold it for upwards of 6 minutes. If every single minute is 10 rounds of combat, that's quite a long time if you're actually engaging in a fight during that time. When a creature runs out of breath, it can survive for a number of rounds equal to its constitution modifier, minimum 1 round. After you've run out of these rounds, and at the start of your next turn, you drop to 0 hit points and you start dying. You can't regain hit points or be stabilized until you can breathe again. Those rules are relatively simple, and I think one of the biggest fears that people have with underwater combat is the complexity involved. But these aren't that difficult to manage. The number to remember is your constitution modifier. You add 1 for holding your breath, and you take it as is if you're trying to remain alive after losing what's left of your breath. In the first case, it's the number of minutes you can survive overall, and in the next case, it's the number of rounds before you officially start drowning or suffocating. The next rule set to consider is movement. Swimming is technically considered difficult terrain for any creature that doesn't have a swim speed. Swim speed is usually the first thing that players look for or look to get that can really make or break the difference between being effective in underwater combat and being able to move effectively, or having a much harder time with it. You can gain a swim speed from things like your class, your race more commonly, or magic items. Many of the magic items that grant you swim speed also grant you underwater breathing, which allow you to negate both of those challenges at once. The Cloak of the Manta Ray is a great example. If you want to introduce underwater combat into your game, give your players items and abilities that allow them to be effective or more effective underwater. When those opportunities present themselves, the players will likely want to chase down or look into the opportunity to actually use these boons that they've acquired. With holding your breath and movement out of the way, that brings us to actual combat. The combat rules are not that complicated either. With combat, when you're making a melee weapon attack, a creature that doesn't have a swimming speed has disadvantage on the attack roll unless the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident, which are all piercing weapons and can be used more naturally effectively underwater. So the key here is to either have something in your arsenal that you can use well underwater, that you're proficient in, hopefully, or to have a swim speed and just use the weapon that you normally use in combat. With ranged weapons, you also have to deal with the fact that you automatically miss a target beyond the weapon's normal range. So if you would have disadvantage because you're shooting at that extended range for your weapon, instead, you just miss automatically. And even if you are targeting a creature that's within your normal range, you roll with disadvantage unless the weapon is a crossbow, net, or a thrown weapon like a javelin, spear, trident, or dart. While these rules can seem quite restrictive, if you take the time to plan for them ahead of time, I think you can actually create a really engaging narrative experience for your players and give them opportunities to bypass some of these drawbacks or to deal with the more difficult challenge of having to contend with this new environment. Players can be frustrated when they're confronted with something out of their expectations, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Instead, I think the variety in the kind of combat encounters and the way players feel in their combat, whether they feel well equipped for it or not equipped for it, are good things to include in your games. The combat rules go deeper. If you want to use firearms or explosives, these typically don't work underwater unless you have something exceptional to your home game that you want to rule differently. And with spellcasting, I tend to rule that any spell with verbal components can't really be cast underwater. Now, if the creature can breathe underwater, then it should be fine. They should be allowed to cast as normal. I don't think it should obstruct any character that is meant to be capable underwater. There are also some changes you can make to the rules to adapt how spellcasting interacts with underwater combat. For example, if a player wants to cast a spell with a verbal component during an underwater fight, you can allow them to do so under the penalty of losing a minute of breath if they're actually holding their breath, or losing a round if they've already have started to suffocate. If you feel that's too harsh, you can reduce the amount of time from a minute to 30 seconds, but I like the round even numbers. They make things easier to track. 10 rounds at a time, or just one round if they're already starting to suffocate. This leads to a really cool narrative moment where the players can decide whether they want to take this risk. And if they do take the risk and the amount of breath they lose takes them down to 0, then they'll start to suffocate immediately. Or if they were already suffocating, they'll drop to 0 hit points at the start of their next turn. If you want to be a little bit more, mechanical about it, you can also make it subject to a D10 so that the player rolls, and that's however many rounds they lose off their breath every time they want to cast something with a verbal component. You can even apply this to just speaking in general, and that can be an interesting way to increase the tension and force players to react to the environment. With spellcasting, it's also important to remember that any creature that's fully submerged has resistance to fire damage. So, like I said, these are restrictive rules, but they can lead to interesting narrative opportunities for your game, where players have to make difficult choices that don't necessarily have a right answer, and can be forced to confront situations that they don't typically confront in other adventures or in other games. Besides, I just think that underwater combat is cool. The three-dimensional nature of it changes the way that you think about combat, that you think about tactics and where you're placed. Even if you're not visually representing it with some sort of 3D battle map, which are not too complicated to put together and you can look up online, you can just do it theater of the mind style and say that you have, enemies coming from ahead, from above, from behind. It's easier underwater for a party to get separated and to be put in a more difficult position against enemies that they're contending against. Even weaker enemies, better adapted for the environment, are going to pose a difficult challenge underwater for an unprepared party. Now, I do think you should be intentional with your underwater combat and understand the effect it's going to have on your players and kind of what you're asking them to do and engage in terms of the game that you're playing together. There's a few different ways that you can frame the nature of the underwater experience you want your players to have. Perhaps it's about the time pressure, and the breath that they can hold onto is a ticking time bomb, and they need to get in and get out and acquire whatever they need. For example, a treasure lost on a sunken ship before they run out of breath. And the creatures that they encounter, they might not want to fight, but they might just want to try to hold off and run away from while they're struggling with their own breath. Or perhaps you want to play up those disadvantages and the difficulty of combat. If you have a party that's very combat-oriented, then these challenges are going to be tactically and strategically satisfying and stimulating for your players. They're not going to be frustrated, hopefully, that they're dealing with this. Instead, they're going to relish the challenge, and if they have the tools in front of them to overcome it, then they're going to be really happy on the other side when they succeed at overcoming a difficult obstacle. Lastly, my favorite is just exploring the underwater world. This is a whole different ecosystem that you can introduce your players to. If your goal is to focus more on the narrative and exploratory aspects of the game when they're underwater, then maybe forcing them to consider breath and things like that aren't right for you. While I wouldn't remove those rules entirely because they can be useful tools in your arsenal as a DM, you can just think about providing them with the tools and equipment, potions, or blessing to grant them underwater breathing or to grant them swim speed, so they feel more comfortable exploring underwater. If you set a civilization deep under a lake, but the players are worried about running out of breath before they reach it, they might not decide to go and venture as far. But if they have underwater breathing, they can look around, and you increase the chances of your players encountering something you actually spent a lot of time designing or integrating into your game. Of course, anything underwater will always be a challenge for your players unless the players have created characters meant to function underwater, like the Tritons. If you want to play up the difficulties of being underwater and questing underwater, there are some additional rules and elements you can introduce. For example, you could force realism at the table. That rule about speaking and costing breath in order to speak can force your players to try to actually communicate non-verbally. Either try to make them actually do it in person, like playing charades, or just force them to only say things like, I point over in this direction, or I point at this thing, and try to indicate this motion rather than actually communicating. This won't be for everyone, but for players that like a challenge in roleplay, as long as the stakes aren't too high, this could be a really fun moment in your game. Separately, you could also ramp up the stakes even higher by forcing them to make Constitution saving throws when they take damage underwater to try to retain their breath. If they fail the con save, which you can treat kind of like a concentration saving throw, you can have them lose a certain amount of breath, either a set amount or one that they roll for at each time. Another rule you can include, which is interesting whether you're going more in the combat direction or the exploration direction, are the underwater visibility rules. You can change the amount of natural light that they have from 60 to 30 to 15 feet, depending on how obstructed or how clear or murky the water is and how deep they are. The closer they are to the surface, the more light will naturally come through. The cleaner the water is, the more light they'll naturally get to come through. But the deeper and murkier the water gets, the less light they'll have, and the harder it'll be for them to actually see anything underwater. If you want to play into that obstruction direction, you can even create other environmental factors like floating shipwreck debris that would force the water to actually become difficult terrain, further reducing the speed of anyone swimming through it without a swim speed and actually affecting those that have a swim speed too. I love this idea of having a shipwreck underwater causing you problems with your visibility, also with your movement, but also providing cover and leading to a very tense encounter. And if you're going more in the exploration direction, there's a whole rule about swimming long distances. I've got it here. It says, essentially, unless aided by magic, a character can't swim a full 8 hours per day. After each hour of swimming, a character must succeed on a DC 10 con saving throw or gain a level of exhaustion. Swimming through deep water is even more difficult. It's similar to traveling at high altitudes because of the water's pressure and cold temperature. For a creature without a swimming speed, each hour spent swimming at a depth greater than 100 feet counts as 2 hours for the purpose of determining exhaustion. Swimming for an hour at a depth greater than 200 feet counts as 4 hours. So it gets difficult regardless of water. I kind of treat this as an optional rule. I don't think you have to include it. But if you really want to push on the realism and make the exploration have some stakes and difficulty, it's a good one to include. That's really it. I think you should consider underwater exploration and underwater combat because you can take your players to new and interesting sites that they don't get to visit in other games or even in most of the games of D&D that they've gotten to play. I'm sure more of this will happen with Ghosts of Saltmarsh, but take them to submerged shipwrecks, take them to lost cities and sunken temples, take them to all these cool places, and keep watching this channel. I'm making videos every Friday about nerdy things and usually about D&D or writing and creativity. So if you like this video, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment below if you've done some fun stuff underwater. And that's it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Friday.